the success of our cities in the future will depend entirely upon how we, as citizens, improve it and take it on. And change is really in our hands. So what can we do if most of our cities today are determined by really this old process of the investors and the banks? Who is it that makes the city? Is it really the people who live there? And is that even possible? Most of the people living in cities today are confronted with the issue of incredibly high-priced luxury living and very little older buildings that are being renovated. And is there a way maybe to do what we do on a small scale when we have a family, when our single-family home? We look at financing this, going to the bank, and building exactly what we want. Is there a way to bring this together in a larger scale, in an urban situation, where we have more people coming together and building our houses on top of each other? Now, this is something that's happened in Berlin, where people get together, buy land, and build in a very pragmatic way, one on top of each other. It's called the Baugruppe. But this is something that has transformed in the last 15 years enormously. When it started, well, this is something that has a long tradition, but when it kind of restarted maybe 15 years ago in Berlin, it was a very, very pragmatic kind of solution to what was going on. So I'd like to talk to you today about what it is and maybe what it can be and what the vision could be. Because today in our cities, our cities internationally, particularly in Europe, are 80% built. But the success of our cities in the future will mean densifying these cities in a way that keeps them within the borders. But with everything that we add, it adds to a sustainable solution where people have they can afford to live there and they can integrate their own very specific way of life. So where we do this maybe in an urban realm, take it over, change it. This is the Mauerpark in Berlin, where just one person went with his karaoke machine and started inspiring other people to do this. And now this is what it looks like every weekend. And this was a kind of an unused kind of park situation. So he's transformed the space and the entire area around it just with his one simple act of taking on the space. And urban gardening is something, of course, here I see you all with plants. So this is something where we realize that we as citizens can have a hand in changing the place where we live. And maybe even this is the 90s in Berlin, where things were, let's say, the spirit of what has enabled us to kind of take on our own spaces in a built sense. This is Realities United, who cut open a hole in the roof and made it into a convertible. And as we look at spaces and how they've transformed, we see that there's still, this is just 7 years ago in Berlin, an area in the very center of the city, we see that there are always little pockets that can be taken over and can be, that allow us to envision something for the very center of the city. Not every space is taken up. So it will, getting back to the story of Berlin, people were not finding what they wanted on the market, and very importantly, met each other, came together and said, well, look, there is opportunity for us to do this together if we pool our resources. So they were really looking for good neighborhoods and creating spaces that suited their needs and that were changeable and adaptable in the future. Places that were future-oriented and where they could make their own decisions. And really, in doing so, so many of these projects were built in such a short period of time that they really defined new participation and ways to do this. So there are many different kinds of ways to come together and ways to buy the site and ways to develop the project. But they've also defined new standards in architecture, particularly in how much can be built for what price. looking at even just a very small area, this happens to be Prenzlauer Berg, where there were a lot of, let's say, holes in the city, which are now built with a lot of these kinds of co-op or co-housing projects or co-op associations. There were so many in the market at the same time that they've now redefined the price-quality relationship. These projects were built to a very low price comparable to what was available on the market, and offered an incredibly high ecological standard and building standard. So I looked at many projects and the qualities that they gave or give for the city, and most importantly, looking at how people have determined if they could make their decisions living in the inner city. Like, what did they choose? So they chose, in many cases, to take real gems and to reestablish them, to revamp them, to renovate them. They chose to share spaces. Not only the roof terrace, but a whole, as these projects grew and as the people, and they became more, let's say, known, people really went kind of a full circle in thinking about, well, what can we do if we actually are pooling our resources and we're to get in it together anyway? Then what spaces can we share that make our lives more livable in the inner city? And so looking at common spaces, common rooms, guest rooms, shared terraces, even a sauna or even a small swimming pool. So all of the families and projects have chosen to share their garden space. So none of them actually close it off. They share it with each other. Some projects even create space that's open to the public. So in many cases, in this project specifically, but in many projects, they've also decided, they've thought about how will we be able to divide and change these spaces over time when our living situation changes. How can we adapt the building, and what makes it adaptable? Is it just a folding wall, or is it really much more about being able to combine different spaces? And at the moment it's rented out, or later it's rented out, and at the moment it's together. So these are very innovative and maybe very personal spaces that have been able to be created, but also spaces that are generally much more adaptable and flexible. And here in this particular instance, the city planning didn't want the project to have balconies, but they have an amazing view towards the TV tower and this beautiful cobblestone street towards the south where the sun shines down. What do you mean we can't have a balcony? So they decided to commission an artist to work together with the architect, and they made a fold-out door balcony. So it's not really a balcony, but it is. So they fold out this, they open it up, and it transforms into a balcony. So this has inspired a lot of other projects to think outside of the box, to think, okay, well, what can we do if we can really determine, if we can work together with an architect, if we can come together, if we're anyway thinking about buying a flat, an apartment in the inner city. So if we're just stacking our financing, right? So it's really no more than coming together to organize this in a way that can be even more affordable and where we can make these decisions ourselves. So in many cases, I found, looking at these projects, that the people there that were willing to go through this process with each other, discussing, making decisions together, that they really take on a lot of responsibility for their neighborhood and really identify themselves, obviously, with the place where they live. But they've also contributed to sustainability, investing, being able to choose what they invest in. They've chosen to invest very highly in ecological building quality. Many of the buildings are passive building standard, even though they didn't have to be. Now, generally in Germany, we build to a very high standard, and it's the new requirements require nearly a passive standard, or even Energy Plus. But two groups with separate architects have also invested in complete wooden building technologies. And it's these kind of experiments, for example, that are really important for our city in the future, as is investing in the mixed city. So if we want to make our cities better, the way that we heard about the mobility this morning, it's going to have to be that we as city planners, architects, think about how we can mix uses. Just the way the traditional European city was, we have mixed use at the bottom, living at the top. How can we reinstate that and bring that back? This is one project by Bar Architects that really thinks about how this mix can happen. How that at the top floor we have living with a smaller portion and a larger portion that can be combined and separated then at a later time, so very adaptable. With a midsection that has a live-work situation, so it's a split level kind of live-work small short-term visitation. And at the bottom, at the bottom we have a shop and even an art space that gives something back to the city. So here the live-work space and the street situation. So again, all of these projects are investing in the future and making decisions that are quite different from this very generic what is the profit, what is sellable, and they've created spaces that are quite different to what was on the market. So I'd like to show some of these in detail. Again, the projects have grown quite a lot from these very small infill projects to much larger projects, so they really have quite an effect on the market, and they're quite an important part now of the development in Berlin. They, this is maybe just very briefly a small project where you can see the idea is to be able to provide for families who normally have to live out, to move outside of the city because they simply don't find the kind of situation or even architectural solution for living in the city that they need. So this solution shows more of how can we stack maybe a single family home on top of each other. So creating buying the site together and looking at how we divide this up. This is a type that, let's say, with the townhouse typology, you're building next to each other. So it's a very simple kind of start with these kinds of projects where we buy the site together, but we divide it up even before we start to build. And this is a project solution that looks at combining those typologies in the inner city. So we have a tight inner city block situation where it's more of a townhouses to the front and two stacked single-family houses in the back on top of it. And so it gives us a real kind of alternative to the normal flats that we usually get in the inner city. This is the way it looks, the townhouses to the street, and they're shared, very safe, open courtyard in the middle of the block. This is how the penthouse looks over the garden space, but over to the city. And this is an example that looks at these after-war developments in the inner city, and how can we redevelop these and maybe take some of these buffer zone green spaces that really aren't used by anybody, densify, but even make these spaces better by doing so. This is a project called the Ritterstraße by IV Jesko-Fezer and Heide von Beckerath architects. They build up to the street edge and they open their garden space to the neighborhood, but have really used that garden space. It's also a project that looks at how can they work together, how can they share spaces. It shares over 22% of its space and they have balconies that go around the entire project. These are all shared, and and really when they're open, the children, they've said that the children that live within the house and the project, they tend to have a completely different kind of circulation through the building, and they have a ground floor space, which you can see here, and they share the rooftop and a gardening space together. And this ground floor space, this very open shared living room, this is open to the community. They can rent it out for just the cost of what it costs and use it for parties as well as the people who live there. So This is the project called Spreefeld, which also, not only is it highly ecological, it's also highly ideological, looking at how can we even be able to include people from the neighborhood in a place that was along the river. Obviously, this was an area that was taken over by beach bars and a lot of private startup young initiative for temporary use. And so in coming there, they didn't want to just kick off the people who had always been there. They wanted to find a solution that would integrate possibly even the people who had already been there, but at least people who were ready and willing to start new things there. They wanted to be able to bring the street that was very much cut off from the river to the river and create open public space within these, within the new buildings. And so, and they wanted to create a situation that was not only ownership-based, and so they created an entirely new co-op association. So the people that participate in the project, they pay rent to the association, and the association has actually built the project. The project is also not on land that is owned by the association. This is a new push and a new discussion in Berlin that they had been selling. Berlin had been in dire economic need, selling their land. Now, of course, it's worth much more, so we've actually lost money, so it hasn't improved our situation at all. But so the discussion is, when city-owned land is being used or thought that it might be sold or used, that it should be actually used for specific use. So there was a competition that, like an investor competition, so who would create the most amenities that would give something back to the public and to the surrounding communities. So I think this is also a very, I would like to mention it on this, with this project, because I think it's a very important issue when we think about how can we build in the inner cities, how can we support new ways of thinking and new projects. The city needs land in the inner city to be able to support this in any way. So particularly when the economic situation is so that investors are very quick, in order to support these groups, really all they need is a little bit of time to get money together, because they need more time than an investor. So, but they are strong economically because they are powerful in their numbers. So in that way, this group has succeeded in doing many things, in achieving a very long, sustainable, low-rent situation, very completely open to the public, creating shared spaces. They have experimental living. This is their own shared space. Experimental living situations with cluster living, that's like groups of people living in their private, like where they have private cells that all merge onto very shared, open living room and kitchen spaces. This is one of those kinds of cluster living, but they have cluster living for older people, they have cluster living for families, whoever wanted to come together, but they also have normal apartments. So, and conceptually, this is how it looks, that the land is not owned and they have shared spaces throughout the entire project. So this is what they've built on that side of the river. And on the other side of the river, I'm not going to have time to go into it, but it's that project, as well as the other projects, has inspired new ways to think about how we use our land and how the development particularly along the river, that was actually slated to be just office buildings, is now being rethought and taken over in a way that the development will be much more open to the public and make spaces along the river that are for the public. So this project, which is Holzmark Plus, is about startups. It's about integrating ecology and all kinds of ecological ideas into the development. So just a small vision here of what it can be. And part of that project is a very large development that by Kleihuis and Kleihuis architects together with Graft architects, which is a very interesting combination, that will be a real kind of live-work situation that is intended to be an incubator that will take people, the public, up and integrate them through the building. And along this pathway, they have all kinds of different spaces that open up into the live-work situation. So I hope that the next time you come, you'll be able to see that project a little bit further along, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristien. What these projects show, as you said, is that if people are given the choice, they choose quality, sharing, sustainability. These are important priorities for them. That's a strong signal to the market, isn't it?
It should be. I hope so. Yeah, it should be.
Has these projects influenced the commercial part of the housing production in Berlin?
Interestingly, the commercial developers then started to try to offer more choice. But in doing so, they realized how difficult it was. That it's not really just about offering more choice, because it's really bringing the people together to start the project. It's not about choosing where your walls are on the interior of your flat. It's about bringing people together at the very beginning to decide on the entire structure of the project in the building and how they want to share which spaces and which spaces make sense and where these spaces should be, on the roof, on the ground, on every floor, what are they? So the developers were quite overwhelmed. Yeah. And they thought they could sell more projects by calling them the Baugruppe, but it was kind of backfired.
But is there any role for the commercial developers in these kind of projects? I mean, is it possible to
That's very interesting. I think maybe the Viennese or the Austrian model is quite interesting, which we'll hear about. But I think the role of the developer is quite interesting in the organizational role. So if we're talking about investor, we have to speak different about an investor and a developer. The developer has a very important organizational kind of structure that he could offer. And in many other countries, for example, England, in Finland, and in Austria, they have a special role in that kind of facilitating of the projects, that they're built on time. But in Germany, it's a bit different.
Okay, Kristien, thanks.
Okay.
Thank you very much for this beautiful event.